The headlines are correct, but they miss the vector. Defense Blog confirms U.S. missile manufacturing fails to match the tempo of modern warfare. This creates a solvency crisis in kinetic power, but this focus on stockpiles is a strategic misdirection. Adversaries have done the math. They will not engage in a symmetric war of attrition. The primary asymmetric liability is not the arsenal, it is the network. The real threat is not a launch, it is silence. CSIS analysis is clear. The systemic vulnerability lies in the thousands of miles of undersea fiber optic cables that function as the West's central nervous system. This is the silent vector. Sever this network, blind the satellite constellations, and the American war machine becomes a blind leviathan. Immense kinetic power with zero situational awareness. A carrier group without data is not an asset, it is a target. This is the blueprint for checkmate. The motive is not conquest. It is a mathematical calculation designed to trigger a solvency crisis in Western kinetic power. According to CSIS analysis, prolonged, high-intensity conflicts represent a significant domestic liability for state actors like Russia, risking internal instability. The war is unpopular. The objective, therefore, is not to win a symmetric war of attrition. It is to force an asymmetric escalation by exploiting a known vulnerability. Adversaries have read the West's balance sheet. They see the systemic deindustrialization. Between 2000 and 2020, the EU's share of global industrial output collapsed by 6.5 percentage points. This is not a rounding error. It is the sound of an entire continent's manufacturing base being liquidated for short-term energy arbitrage and subsidized foreign labor. They also see the reports from entities like Defense Blog, which confirm U.S. missile manufacturing cannot match the tempo of modern warfare. The bottlenecks are not secret. They are documented liabilities. This creates a critical imbalance. The West's kinetic cost per shot is orders of magnitude higher than an adversary's, while its replacement rate is fatally slow. This weakness forces a pivot. The adversary's strategy is to weaponize this material insolvency. They initiate a conflict and intentionally prolong it, using low-cost, high-volume assets to drain the West's finite stockpiles of high-cost, low-volume precision munitions. The goal is to burn through the West's material capacity, forcing a choice between strategic defeat or escalating to a domain where conventional stockpiles are irrelevant. The central calculation of modern warfare is no longer about tactics. It is an audit of lethality. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, put the math in stark relief. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a balanced exchange. It is an economic annihilation. This 10,000 to 1 cost disparity creates a solvency crisis in kinetic power. The West is fielding assets it cannot afford to lose against threats that are infinitely replaceable. This phenomenon is what military strategists call the democratization of violence. The monopoly on effective standoff firepower, once held exclusively by nation-states with vast industrial bases, is over. That industrial base has been systematically offshored. The European Union's share of global industrial output, for example, collapsed from nearly 21% to just over 14% in 2 decades. Adversaries can now leverage off-the-shelf components to challenge a superpower's material endurance, bypassing billions in legacy defense spending. The strategic calculus for our adversaries becomes brutally simple. Why confront a carrier strike group symmetrically when you can bleed it with 1,000 cuts? They are incentivized to provoke conflicts where they can apply this asymmetric economic leverage. They understand the math. U.S. missile manufacturing is already failing to match wartime tempo. This is a blueprint to drain the hegemon, transforming regional flashpoints into vectors for systemic exhaustion and forcing a launch on warning posture where the final option becomes the only option. The narrative of regional instability, from the Sahel to southern Africa, is a strategic misdirection. These are not chaotic, isolated crises. They are gray zone laboratories. They function as staging areas where adversaries can test Western response times, political will, and, most critically, the material solvency of its kinetic power. Adversary intelligence does not track legacy media. It reads production schedules. They have quantified the systemic decline. They see the European Union's share of global industrial output collapse from 20.8% to a mere 14.3% in 2 decades. Source number 1. They read the analysis, confirmed by figures like John Borrego, that U.S. missile manufacturing cannot sustain the tempo of modern, high-intensity warfare, was number 3. This industrial deficit is the central variable in their risk calculus. It incentivizes the use of proxies as disposable assets to drain Western stockpiles. Reports of instability from South Africa, or even internal vulnerabilities noted by CSIS analysts, are not the root cause of the threat. They are symptoms of a deliberate strategy, a war of attrition fought by remote control. The mechanism is an escalation trap. Each regional flare-up, from Iranian provocations, source number 4, to proxy attacks, forces a withdrawal from the West's kinetic bank account. The adversary's goal is to engineer a solvency crisis, forcing a choice: concede territory or burn through irreplaceable munitions on low-cost threats. The logical endpoint is to corner a conventionally depleted hegemon, leaving it with only one remaining move on the escalation ladder. This is the direct vector to nuclear brinkmanship. When a power's industrial base can no longer sustain a symmetric fight, its final strategic option becomes a launch-on-warning posture, where conventional stockpiles are irrelevant. Adversaries are betting the West lacks the will for that final step. The math is not a theory. It is an incentive structure. The final variable in this equation is not kinetic. It is temporal. The launch-on-warning doctrine is a protocol of desperation, a mathematical concession to geography and missile velocity. It dictates that a nation launches its nuclear arsenal upon detection of an incoming enemy launch, before the incoming warheads detonate. You do not wait for confirmation of impact because waiting guarantees the decapitation of your command structure and the destruction of your own silos. You launch into the unknown. Now, introduce the accelerant, the fog of digital war. A systemic cyber attack, a zero-day exploit targeting NORAD or its NATO equivalent, does not need to destroy a single asset. It only needs to blind the system. When early warning satellites and ground-based radar screens flicker from incoming to no signal, the protocol is thrown into chaos. The commander is now forced to make a world-ending decision based on the last valid data point received. This is not a theoretical exercise. Analysts at CSIS have repeatedly warned that nuclear command, control, and communications, NC3, are a primary target for adversary cyber operations. The commander's fear is rational. With U.S. missile manufacturing unable to sustain a high-intensity conflict and European industry in a state of systemic decline, there is no capacity for a prolonged conventional fight. The solvency crisis in kinetic power is absolute. The industrial buffer is gone. Therefore, blinding the radar is the ultimate asymmetric vector. An adversary calculates that a hegemon with a hollowed-out industrial base cannot afford the risk of a successful first strike. They know the commander is cornered. The cyber attack forces a binary choice: launch on the ghost of a signal and risk accidental apocalypse, or hesitate and risk guaranteed conventional defeat followed by nuclear blackmail. This is how regional disputes are escalated to nuclear brinkmanship by design. The final stage of economic warfare is not kinetic. It is logistical. An adversary does not need to match the West's carrier groups if it can sever the supply chains that fuel them. The systemic erosion of industrial capacity, documented in the EU's slide from 20.8% to 14.3% of global output, is a known variable. The U.S. inability to scale missile manufacturing to match wartime tempo is a public fact. RUSE analysts note this creates a solvency crisis in kinetic power. The math dictates the adversary's next move, a low-cost, high-impact probe to test the system's breaking point. This is not a forecast of war. It is a forecast of a calibration shot. The target will not be a military base. It will be a node of economic transmission. Expect a coordinated, attribution-impossible cyber-physical event within the next 12 months, targeting the terminal operating system and local power substation of a Tier 1 Northern European container port. The event will likely occur between March and June 2025, after the EU's Delayed Industrial Accelerator Act proves its impotence. The objective is not destruction, but paralysis. To trigger a multi-week shutdown, inject chaos into just-in-time supply chains, and measure the political and economic response time of a deindustrialized alliance. It is an asymmetric probe designed to quantify the West's material endurance before a kinetic event is even initiated. The goal is to prove with data that the hegemon is insolvent,